Hello, dear students. I am Associate Professor of Department of Human Anatomy and Medical Terminology of Azerbaijan Medical University, Anar Abdullayev. And today we have a new lecture. The title of our today's lecture is Pathways of the Brain and Spinal Cord, their classification, associative pathways, the commissural fiber system, projection fiber system, extraceptive pathways, proprioceptive and intraceptive pathways. Also, we'll talk about the efferent or descending pathways, the conducting tracts of the extrapyramidal system, the pathways of the cerebellum. As always, I've prepared the plan of our today's lecture. According to this plan, we'll talk about the pathways of the brain and spinal cord and their classification. Then we move on the associative pathways and the commissural fiber system. Then we'll talk about the projection fiber system, extraceptive pathways, proprioceptive and intraceptive pathways. Finally, we'll talk about the efferent or descending pathways, the conducting tracts of the extrapyramidal system and pathways of the cerebellum. What is the pathways, the conducting tract? Sometimes these ways are called the conducting tracts of the central nervous system. According to the common structure and the function, the nerve fibers connect different parts of the gray matter of CNS, central nervous system, and take definite site in the brain and the spinal cord, uniting into the system of bundles. And these bundles are called the conducting tracts. Direction of these tracts are very important. According to the direction of the nerve fibers, three groups of conducting tracts are distinguished in the spinal cord and the brain. First of all, association or associative fibers, the commissural fibers and the projection fibers. This is the special diagram which shows the bundles of fibers present within the cerebral hemisphere, within the same cerebral hemisphere. You can observe the superior and inferior longitudinal fascicles, perpendicular fascicle, cingulum, and the alternate fasciculus or bundle. The main feature of these all tracts on this diagram is the localization. They are localized. It's a region of the same cerebral hemisphere. These are the associative fibers. They are localized in the region and of the same cerebral hemisphere, and they connect the parts, several different lobes or gyruses within the same cerebral hemisphere. For example, frontal lobe with temporal lobe, or frontal lobe with occipital lobe, right frontal lobe with the right temporal lobe, for instance. And this is the coronal section of the brain. Also, this section shows association, commissural, and the projection fibers. The commissural fibers cross the midline and connect the identical, the symmetric parts of the two different hemispheres. I have to note, all fibers crossing from one side of the brain to the another side cannot be considered as a commissural fibers. When fibers originating in the mass of the gray matter in one half of the CNS and in the some other mass of the gray matter of the opposite half, these tracts are referred to as the decussating fibers, and the sites where such crossing take place are referred to as decussations, just decussation. For example, you are familiar with the pyramidal decussation. Commissural fibers, they connect only identical parts, symmetric parts of the two different cerebral hemispheres. And about the association fibers, as I've explained, the association or associative fibers, the Latin name native fibrae associationis, connect different areas of the gray matter of one cerebral hemisphere, where we have to distinguish them as short and the long association fibers. The short fibers connect neighboring section of the gray matter or gyruses of one lobe of the hemisphere, like in this picture, the superior longitudinal fascicle, uncinate fascicle, and long fibers connect different sections of the gray matter of different lobes located at a greater distance from each other. And the following long fibers are distinguished. First of all, the fasciculus longitudinalis superior. This is the fasciculus longitudinalis superior, the superior longitudinal bundle. It connects the frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, and the posterior part of the temporal lobe. Very important associative tract. Inferior longitudinal bundle, or the fascicle, fasciculus longitudinalis inferior, lies in the inferior sections of the hemisphere and connects the temporal lobe with the occipital lobe. This one. Uncinate bundle, fasciculus uncinatus, like in this animation. It connects the frontal pole, the most anterior point of the frontal lobe, with the temporal pole of the temporal lobe. I want to repeat all these fibers, the previous superior longitudinal bundle and inferior longitudinal bundle or uncinate bundle, they are localized in the same hemisphere. Of course, we have the left inferior longitudinal bundle, right uncinate bundle, but the localization within the borders of the same cerebral hemisphere, connection of the points, of course points, the conditional term which I am using here, within the same right to right, left to right, within the same cerebral hemispheres. These fibers are localized and they connect the different points of the same cerebral hemisphere. They don't form decussations actually. Decussation is formed by the decussating fibers. Decussation means passing from the right to left side, from the left to right side. It's just decussation. But if the decussation fibers, they connect the identical points of the two different cerebral hemispheres, they are referred to as the commissural fibers. Next associative fiber is called the cingulum bundle. Cingulum, fasciculus cingulum, connects different cortical areas of the cingulum gyrus. There are many parts of the brain, the medial section of the brain, which are belong to the cingulum gyrus, and the cingulum bundle connects these different points with each other. About the commissural fibers and their largest commissural tract of our body is called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum, this one, You are familiar with this structure from your practical classes, and it is largest, as I have explained, the largest commissural fiber. But on your preparation of your practical classes, you have deal with this section. It's just the cross section of the corpus callosum. Actually, it consists of the many fibers which form the radiation corpus callosi. They connect the same points of the frontal lobes, the parietal, occipital lobes, and so on. It's composed of commissural nerve fibers crossing from one hemisphere to the other. It is situated at the bottom, at the deep part of the fissura longitudinalis cerebri. The fissura longitudinalis cerebri, like in this animation, separates two cerebral hemispheres. But at the deep part of this fissure, we can observe the corpus callosum, and it is 3 centimeters behind the anterior end of the hemispheres and 6 centimeters in front of the posterior end of the hemisphere. It surrounds the horns of the lateral ventricles. As you know, lateral ventricles consist of the anterior horn, which corresponds to frontal lobe, posterior horn, it corresponds to the occipital lobe, the inferior horn within the temporal lobe, and the central part, it's the cavity or the remnant of the cavity of the parietal lobe, and it covers these horns. Underneath this third ventricle, the remnant of the cavity of diencephalon, or the between brain, is located. In the corpus callosum, the following parts are distinguished. The anterior part, this one, is called the genu corpus callosi. Middle part is called the trunk, or the truncus corpus callosi, and the posterior part, the massive part, actually is called the splenium corpus callosi. Anterior part is the genu, then the trunk, and the splenium. Again, you are looking at the corpus callosum. The anterior end of the genu corpus callosum curves downward and assumes a beak-like structure. It is called the rostrum corpus callosi, which then continues with a seen plate, or the lamina rostralis, in turn passes to the lamina terminalis here. The rostrum continues to lamina terminalis. The dorsal surface, the back surface of the corpus callosum, looks to the upper portion, to the fissura longitudinalis cerebri, and this portion, the back part of the corpus callosum, is covered with a thin layer of the gray matter. This layer is called the indusium griseum. Outside this covering, the medial and the lateral longitudinal stripes are located. Again, you are looking at the frontal section and the corpus callosum. This is the upper part, which looks to the fissura longitudinalis cerebri, and these are stripes on the back part of the corpus callosum. This is the sagittal section, and also you are looking at the lateral ventricle, the genu, which passes to the rostrum. It continues to the lamina terminalis. This is trunk, then the splenium corpus callosi, and the commissural fibers in the white matter of the hemisphere near the corpus callosum form the radiation corpus callosi, and it has anterior, intermediate, and the posterior parts. The anterior part corresponds to the genu, corpus callosi, that passes to the anterior part of the frontal lobes and forms the frontal fertilizer, forceps frontalis. Forceps frontalis. The intermediate part of the radiation corpus callosi corresponds to its trunk and moves to the posterior part of the frontal lobe and the white matter of the parietal lobe. The posterior part of the radiation of the corpus callosi corresponds to the splenium and moves to the temporal and the occipital lobes. The part that passes through the occipital lobe is called the occipital fertilizer, forceps occipitalis, and combines the cortex of the occipital lobes. The part of the radiation corpus callosi that forms the superior wall of the inferior and the posterior horns of the lateral ventricle is called the carpet, tapetum. Yes, the corpus callosum is the largest commissural fiber of our central nervous system, but there are several parts of the brain which cannot be connected by the corpus callosum. It means that we need the other structures with the same function, commissural fibers. One of them is called the anterior commissure, this one. Of course, it is smaller than the corpus callosum, but it has the very important function. It lies across on the anterior wall of the third ventricle. Third ventricle actually is bounded by the thalamus, and the anterior part, it has the anterior part and the posterior part, or the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Pars anterior of the anterior commissure, also sometimes the anterior part is called the pars olfactoria, because it connects the olfactory lobes of the both hemispheres. The posterior part is composed of the thick bundles and connects the both anterior and the medial parts of the both temporal lobes. And about the ascending tracts and the projection fibers, we have to talk about them. Projection fibers, they join the cerebral cortex with the inferiorly located structures. I mean the brainstem, I mean the cerebellum and the spinal cord. Of course, the direction of the projection fibers, it can be ascending, and it means from lower structures to upper structures, from brainstem or from the spinal cord in direction to the cerebral cortex. Of course, these fibers are sensory because they carry any kind of information, visual, hearing, skin information, touch, temperature, pain, and so on. They call the ascending fibers. And the descending fibers. Descending fibers, they carry information from the upper structures, I mean the cerebral cortex, different lobes of the cerebral cortex, in direction to the spinal cord, to cerebellum, to the brainstem, and they are motor tracts. Ascending fibers are the ascending afferent or sensory tracts, and descending fibers, they are motor or efferent tracts. And depending on the receptors, of course, we'll talk about the receptors, but you know they are the most terminal structures, most terminal endings of dendrites. They can be localized in the skin or the mucous membranes or within the walls of the tubular organs or within the articular capsules, the tendons. It means that they must be classified as extraceptors. Extraceptors, they are receptors receive the information from outside, from external environment, visual information, hearing information, and the taste information, the also smell impulses, all impulses which received by the skin, pain, temperature, touch, all of them. And extraceptive tract, the tracts starting from these receptors are called the extraceptive ascending tracts. Proprioceptors, the proper receptors of our body, they are localized within the elements of the locomotor apparatus. I mean the tendons, the muscles, the articular capsules, the ligaments. They are responsible for the coordination, for the balance of our body. And the tracts, of course, these tracts are ascending because they carry information about the body balance to the upper structures, to the brain, voluntary tract, and to the cerebellum, involuntary tracts to the cerebellum. These tracts are called the proprioceptive tracts. Proprioceptive because they start from the proper environment of our body, I mean the locomotor apparatus. And interoceptive tracts, as you can realize, that they start from the interoceptors, and localization of the interoceptors, the internal organs, the tubular organs, the glands, the vessels, blood vessels, lymph vessels, and so on. We have to start with the extraceptive tracts, and one of them, the lateral spinothalamic tract, the contracting tracts of the skin, pain and temperature senses, and this tract consists of the three levels of the neurons. The first neuron, which receives the information and passes the information to the second intermediate neuron, and from the intermediate neuron this impulse of course continues to the third neuron. Actually, lateral spinothalamic tract, it doesn't end in thalamus. Spinothalamic indicates to direction from the spinal cord to thalamus. But you have to know the thalamus is not the point of destination of this tract. But actually, these tracts are called conditional, of course, where the second neuron ends, and the second neuron of this tract ends in thalamus. Because of this fact, the tract is conditionally called the spinothalamic, because we have the two spinothalamic tracts, anterior and the lateral spinothalamic tract. We have to define them. We have to distinguish. The lateral spinothalamic tract is responsible for the pain and temperature impulses to carry off these impulses, and touch impulses, mechanical impulses from the skin are carried by the ventral spinothalamic tract. But we have to explain the first of all the lateral spinothalamic tract. This tract, as I have explained, consists of the three neurons. The cell body of the first neuron is in the spinal ganglion. Spinal ganglion, which is located at the origin of the intervertebral foramen. The peripheral processes, the spinal ganglion consists of the pseudo unipolar or the false unipolar neurons. The peripheral processes arises from the cells of this ganglion, runs in the skin nerve to the receptor located in some part of the skin, and it receives the pain and temperature stimuli. The dendrites, ending elements of the dendrites, receive the pain and temperature impulses from the corresponding segment of the skin. But the central process of the ganglion, it forms the posterior root of the spinal cord, and under this name it enters into the spinal cord via the posterior lateral groove, and here it terminates in the spinal cord. Actually, it was in the posterior horn of the spinal cord, and the nucleus which receives this information is called the proper nucleus. Just I have to note the ganglion and the nucleus, both are the accumulation of the cell bodies of the neurons. But the classification is important. If this accumulation locates outside from the CNS, it's called the ganglion. Within the CNS, accumulation, not mechanical accumulation, it's not only mechanical accumulation of the cell bodies. They have the very strict functional properties, but they must be called the nuclei. The same thing, actually, the accumulation of the cell bodies outside from the CNS. Actually, spinal ganglion, yes, it's called the spinal ganglion. It is belong to spinal segment, yes. It takes place in formation of the spinal nerve, the corresponding spinal nerve, but it is not the part of the spinal cord. Spinal cord locates within the canalis vertebralis. Spinal ganglion very close to it, but not within the this canal, and not within the spinal cord. It must be called the ganglion. But nucleus, proper nucleus of the posterior horn, it's the part of the spinal cord. It must be called the proper nucleus. And the first level of the neurons, it's the part of spinal ganglion. Spinal ganglion actually is the first degree neuron of this way, of the lateral spinothalamic tract. Like in the game, three players, first player starts and then takes something, for example, anything, maybe ball, to the second one. The second one, our proper nucleus within the posterior horn of the spinal cord. And now we have deal with the second neuron. The main function of the first neuron is ended. And the axons of the second neuron cross the midplane here in the white commission, then ascends in the lateral funiculus of the opposite side. Because of this fact, it's called the lateral spinothalamic tract. It ascends like the element of the lateral funiculus. As you know, the white matter of the spinal cord is divided into three pairs of funiculus: anterior, lateral, and the posterior. As the element of the lateral funiculus, it ascends to the thalamus and ends in the dorsolateral nucleus of the thalamus. The dorsolateral nucleus of the thalamus contains the cell body of the third neuron. And the axons from the dorsolateral nucleus of the thalamus pass via the posterior limb of the internal capsule to the cortex of the postcentral gyrus and the superior parietal lobe. Actually, fourth layer of the cerebral cortex, and in the parietal lobe, in the superior parietal lobe and in the postcentral gyrus, the cortical center, the highest center of the skin analyzer, is situated. You are looking at the lateral spinothalamic tract. Information first is received by the spinal ganglion, then the information enters into the posterior horn, the nucleus proprius, then to the opposite side via the anterior commissure of the spinal cord and via the lateral funiculus. It ascends to the thalamus, the third neuron of this tract, to dorsal nucleus, and from here to the parietal lobe, the highest center of this tract is located in the region of the parietal lobe. This tract is decussated. Is totally decussated, dear students, totally decussated. What I mean here, it means that if this tract is affected at the region of the second neuron, I mean the spinal cord, at the opposite side, the pain and temperature impulses cannot be received. These impulses cannot be received by our central nervous system. The human lost these two kinds of information on the opposite side, pain and temperature. And the next tract, also ascending, also extraceptive tract, is called the conducting tracts of the skin tactile senses, tractus spinothalamicus ventralis. And the cell body of the first neuron in the spinal ganglion, as always. And again, the peripheral processes of the spinal ganglia receive the information about what? Touch and mechanical impulses. Just then via the axons of the spinal ganglia, the information, the sensor information, is carried to the spinal cord, to the proper nuclei of the posterior horn, then by the anterior funiculi of the opposite side, it ascends. Because of this fact, the tract is called the ventral or anterior spinothalamic tract. But At the same time, part of these fibers ascends with the posterior funiculus of the same side. It means we have to compare the ventral spinal thalamic tract and the lateral spinal thalamic tract. Lateral spinal thalamic tract is totally decussated. But yes, anterior or ventral spinal thalamic tract is decussated also. But this tract also consists of the non-decussated fibers, because partly it ascends with the anterior funiculus of the same side and partly with the posterior funiculus of the anterior funiculus of the opposite side and the posterior funiculus of the same side. Like in the previous chart, the dorsolateral nucleus contains the cell body of the third neuron, whose axons extend in the thalamocortical tract to the cerebral cortex into the, again, fourth layer of the postcentral gyrus. But the other ascending fibers conduct impulses of touch passing in the posterior funiculus of the same side, and you know from your practical classes the posterior funiculus is divided into two fasciculus: fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis. This is the fasciculus gracilis. It has more medial localization, and the fasciculus cuneatus, and it ascends to the medulla oblongata, and each one ends in the nucleus of the same name. Fasciculus cuneatus ends in the nucleus cuneatus, fasciculus gracilis in the nucleus gracilis. Therefore, the unilateral damage of the spinal cord does not total loss of the feeling of touch and the pressure on the opposite side. Yes, this information, receiving of this information decreases, but not totally lost. About the conducting tract of the olfactory analyzer. As you know, we receive the 80, maybe 90% of the information by our eyes. In our life, the importance of the olfactory tract or the conducting tract of the olfactory analyzer is not so high, like in comparison to the wild animals. But again, we can't imagine our life without the smell organ. It begins from the smell region in the mucosa or in the mucous membrane of the nasal cavity and has three neurons. First neurons, or the smell receptors, are composed of the bipolar neurons and are situated in the smell region of the nasal cavity. As you know from your practical classes, the nasal cavity functionally is divided into two regions. The lower two-thirds, the region respiratory region is called the respiratory region. Upper third forms the olfactory region, and the central processes of first degree neurons form the olfactory fibers. Together they form the first pairs of the cranial nerves, the olfactory nerves, and via the openings on the cribriform plate of the ethmoid, the olfactory nerves enter into the anterior cranial fossa, where they end in the olfactory bulb. The first neurons of this tract are located in the upper portion of the nasal cavity. Second neurons corresponded to the olfactory bulb. And as you know, olfactory bulb continues as olfactory tract. Olfactory tract enlarges and forms the olfactory triangle, behind of which the anterior perforated substance and the septum pellucidum are located. These three elements, olfactory triangle, anterior perforated substance, and the septum pellucidum, form the third neurons of this tract. And the axons of the third neurons form medial, intermediate, and the lateral bands. Actually, the lateral bundle is thicker than the two previous. Medial bundles are going on the corpus callosum as a component of the stria longitudinalis medialis to the hippocampus, and the intermediate bundles pass under the corpus callosum as a component of the fornix cerebri to the pes hippocampi, and the greater lateral part pass and end in the uncus of the parahippocampal gyrus, which is considered as a cortical center of the olfactory analyzer. About the conducting tract of the visual analyzer, our eyes, it consists of the three layers or the membranes. The most internal layer is called the retina, and it consists of the 10 histological layers. Actually, 3 degrees of neurocytes are located in the 4th, 6th, and 8th layers. We can compare with the previous tract, factor analyzer. With 3 neurons, we complete the olfactory analyzer. But 3 neurons just are only located in the eyeball. It explains the importance in our life, the conducting tract of the visual analyzer and the vision organ itself. The light rays before reaching the retina of the eyeball pass through the transparent media for refraction. The cornea of the eyeball, the anterior and the posterior camera, anterior chamber liquid, pupil, lens, and the vitreous body, they are transparent. A transparent feature of these structures are very important for refraction. As a result, the description object falling on the retina causes corresponding irritation its light sensitive elements, rods and the cones, receptors. About rods and cones and the vision organ, so we will talk during our next lecture about the sensory organs. But we have to know these receptors are situated in the 4th layer of the retina and are believed to be the first neurons of the visual analysis. Second neurons that make up the bipolar cells of the 6th layer of the retina transmit the nerve impulses to the 3rd layer or the ganglionic cells of the retina, and it turns axons of the ganglion cells, and they form the axons of the ganglionic cells from the second pairs of the cranial nerves, the optic nerve. Each optic nerve leaves the posterior lobe of the eyeball, yes, and first of all the optic nerve leaves the eyeball, then the orbit, then enters into the optic canal, and here after leaving the optic canal, they partly form the decussation. the region of the sella turcica, actually in front of the sella turcica, form the optic chiasm, chiasma opticus. And the main feature of this decussation is that it is formed by the fibers of the optic nerve, but not all fibers of the optic nerve take place in this decussation. Or for simplification, we can divide the retina like the screen, into two portions. The nasal portion, actually it has no any relation to nose, but it's close to nose, and temporal portion. In decussation, only nasal fibers take place. The lateral or temporal fibers pass to one side. Optic tract, which starts from the optic chiasm, consists of the decussated and non-decussated fibers. It means the optic tract receives the information from the both, from the right and the left eyeballs at the same time. It means after the decussation, after the chiasm, if it's this way is damaged, it leads to hemianapsy, half-bloodness. The two eyes are affected if the tract of the optic analyzer is damaged behind of decussation. The optic chiasma continues backward as the optic tract that are formed by the crossed and uncrossed fibers. Thus, the lateral portion of every optic tract contains fibers running from the lateral half of the retina located on its own side, and the medial portion running from the medial half of the contralateral retina of the eye. Again, you can look at the conducting pathway of the optic analyzer. The optic tract runs around the pedunculus cerebri and ends by dividing into two bundles in the subcortical centers of the vision. Which centers? First of all, the pulvinar ophthalmos and the superior colliculi of the midbrain. Actually, the superior colliculi of the midbrain is reflectory center of this tract, and it is responsible for reflectory actions. I mean the pupil reflex and also ciliary muscle contraction, accommodation actually. The lateral geniculate body is like the pulvinar. It consists of the subcortical center. They are belong to the force. The force neurons of this tract are located in these three structures: pulvinar, the lateral geniculate body, and the superior colliculi. The axons of the force neurons pass through the dorsal part of the posterior genu of the internal capsule and then terminate in the nucleus of the visual analyzer, lying in the cortex of the occipital lobe along the hanks of the calcarine sulcus. So the conducting tract of the visual analyzer is situated as following: retina, then the optic nerve, chiasma opticus, optic radiation, visual cerebral cortex, the calcarine sulcus, cuneus, and the lingual gyrus. The nerve impulses from the gray matter of the superior colliculi transmitted into the nucleus of the oculomotor nerve and its accessory nucleus, or sometimes called the nucleus of Yakubovich or Westphal-Edinger nucleus. Preganglionic parasympathetic fibers beginning from the nucleus of the Yakubovich passes to the ciliary ganglion and terminate in the muscle which constricts the papilla, a pupil, and the ciliary muscle. In response to rotations of the light, the pupil constricted, which is called the pupillary reflex, and the need to take your eyes are turning to the corresponding direction. About the conducting tract of the taste analyzer, actually, three nerves are responsible for this tract. I mean the chorda tympani, which is the branch of the facial nerve. 7 pairs of the cranial nerves are called the facial nerves. Chorda tympani receives the taste impulses from the anterior two-thirds of tongue. The glossopharyngeal nerve, the ninth cranial nerve, it receives the taste impulses from posterior third of tongue, soft palate, and the palatal arch. And the superior laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve is responsible for taste impulses from the epiglottic cartilage and from the medial surfaces of the arytenoid cartilage. First neurons. For the first neurons, the bodies of the first neurons are located in the ganglion of the facial nerve. This ganglion is located in the facial canal of temporal bone. And for the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerves, they are inferior ganglia of corresponding nerves. Inferior ganglion of the ninth and inferior ganglion of the 10th cranial nerve. Then the axons of the first neurons entering the pons and the medulla oblongata terminate in the same nucleus, nucleus tractus solitari. This nucleus is belong to the three nerves at the same time, and the axons from this neuron passes to the thalamus, where the third neuron bodies of the third neurons of this tract are situated. The central processes of the third neurons to extend to the cortical end of the taste analyzer, which is located in the uncus of the parahippocampal gyrus actually. About the hearing analyzer, conducting tract of the hearing analyzer. The sound waves hit the eardrum and it cause it to vibrate. In turn, the vibrations of the eardrum transmitted to the middle ear and cause the vibration of the auditory ossicles that produces the waves, firstly of the perilymph, next the endolymph located in the inner ear, as well as the vibration of the fluid stimulate the special acoustic hair cells or receptors of the spinal organ or the organ of Carty. The spiral organ is located in the inner ear on the spiral membrane, the lower of the cochlear duct. From here, the axons of this ganglion form the cochlear part or hearing part of 8th cranial nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve, 8th cranial nerve, like the first and the second nerves, the olfactory and the optic nerve. It belongs to the sensory nerves. We'll talk about the classification of the cranial nerves. Will distinguish the sensory nerves, the motor nerves, and the mixed nerves. 8th cranial nerve, first, second, and 8th cranial nerves are only sensory nerves. They carry only sensory information. Olfactory nerves actually, because the arrangement of the olfactory nerves is different, because it is formed like the nerve. It's formed by the accumulation of the bundles with just the collectively these bundles form the olfactory nerves. And eighth cranial nerve, it starts from the spinal ganglion and passes to the region of the medulla oblongata. The conductor of the hearing analyzer is made up of the conductors consisting of a number of neurons. So the body of the first neuron lies in the spinal ganglion that contains the bipolar cells. The peripheral process of these cells passes to organ of Carty and terminates in the receptor cells, while the central processes passes as the cochlear component of the vestibulocochlear nerve to its ventral and the dorsal nuclei that lies in the rhomboid fossa. Ventral and the dorsal nuclei are second neurons of this tract. Then the axons of the ventral nuclei passes to opposite side, form the thickness which is called the trapezoid body, corpus trapezoideum, actually, which separates the ventral and the dorsal portions of the pons. And the fibers of the trapezoid body curve laterally on the opposite side of the pons and give the originating to the fibers of the lateral lemniscus. The axons of the cells of dorsal nuclei that run along rhomboid fossa in form of horizontal bands, stria medullaris ventriculi, quarti here, reach to the midline and penetrate into the reticular formation of the pons. Then the fibers at the border between the ventral and dorsal parts of the pons pass across the opposite side and together with fibers of the trapezoid body forms the lateral lemniscus on the opposite side. And the lateral lemniscus ends in the medial geniculate body, which is the subcortical center of the hearing, and at the same time third neuron of this tract, and inferior colliculus, which also consists of the third neurons of the third level of this tract. Inferior colliculus actually is belong to the reflector center of this tract. It has connection with the spinal cord and is responsible for turning of our body in the direction of the voice. But medial geniculate body has connection with the superior temporal gyrus, or the center of the highest center of the hearing analyzer. As I've explained, the inferior colliculus has the connection with the spinal cord. But the statokinetic analyzer consists of the vestibular apparatus and the entire system of all conducting pathways connect with it and reaching the cerebral cortex to determine the position and the movements, the head and the body in the space. Receptors of these analyzers, the special hair cells, which are irritation by the fructiation of the endolymph, are situated in the macula of the utricle, macula of the saccule, and the ampullary part of the semicircular ducts. The receptors of the utricle and the saccule regulate the static equilibrium of the head, while the receptors of the ampulla regulate the dynamic equilibrium of the body moving in space. And the first neuron of the statokinetic analyzer lies in the vestibular ganglia, which is located in the depths of the internal acoustic meatus. The peripheral process of the first neuron communicate with the receptors but central processes as the vestibular component of the vestibular cochlear nerve passes through the internal acoustic meatus into cranial cavity and further into the brainstem, where it divides into the descending and ascending fibers and terminates in the vestibular nuclei, bodies of the second neuron of the vestibular area of the rhomboid fossa. On each side there are 4 vestibular nuclei actually: superior, inferior, medial, and lateral. The ascending fibers terminate in the superior nucleus, while the descending fibers in the inferior, medial, and lateral nucleus. The fibers of the second neurons runs in 3 directions: to cerebellum. Cerebellum is the involuntary center of the involuntary regulation of the balance, to spinal cord, and the fibers which as a component of the medial longitudinal fascicles. The fibers running to cerebellum form the vestibulocerebellar tract and pass through the inferior peduncle, while the fibers running to the spinal cord forms the vestibulospinal tract, and the last one passes into the anterior funiculi of the spinal cord and finishes on the neurons of the anterior horn. So the vestibular reflexes are accomplished by the trunk, limbs, and neck muscles, and for the regulation of the muscle tone. The fibers of the vestibular nuclei, that is component of the medial longitudinal fascicles, establish contact with the nuclei of the nerves of the eyeball muscles. It's very important. A decussated tract that running from the vestibular nuclei to thalamus and in its nuclei, third neuron. The central processes of the third neurons are directed from the optic thalamus to cerebral cortex and ends in the postcentral gyrus and the middle temporal gyrus, cortical end of the statokinetic analyzer, for conscious awareness of the position of the head in space. And about the muscular articular sense from the lower limbs and the lower half of the trunk run in fasciculus gracilis, and those muscular articular senses from the upper limbs and upper part of the trunk along the fasciculus cuneatus. The conducting tract consists of the 3 neurons. The cell body of the first neuron is in the spinal ganglion as always, whose cells are connected by the peripheral process with the muscles and the joints, while the central processes enter into spinal cord and ascends via the posterior funiculi and don't end in any horn of the spinal cord. They ascend in direction to the medulla oblongata and end here in the nucleus of the cuneatus and the nucleus of the gracilis, or the nucleus of Gall and the Bordak. From here, they form the fibers, of course, the internal arcuate fibers, and from the decussation, which is called the decussation. This decussation is very important. Decussation of the medial lemniscus, and then continue as a medial lemniscus. These are ways of the conscious regulation of the body balance, and they end in the thalamus. Again, please look at these ways: proprioceptive tract to the cerebral cortex, in the voluntary regulation of the body balance, via the fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus. They reach the nuclei of the same name, then they form the medial lemniscus from the decussation and they pass to the thalamus. But Partly fibers from the two nuclei, from gracilis and the cuneate nuclei, pass to the cerebellum. Cerebellum, in any case, receives the information about this way. And involuntary ways of regulation of the our body balance, it's very important also. But these tracts, uh, posterior spinal cerebellar tract and anterior spinal cerebellar tract, they are simple. I mean, the arrangement, organization, the number of the neurons, it explains that they are older, the oldest ways of regulation of the body balance. Posterior spinal cerebellar tract, or tractus spinocerebellaris posterior, the first neuron of this tract, again, is situated in the spinal ganglion. Peripheral processes of this ganglia receive the information, muscular action, articular action, and as a component of the posterior root enters the posterior horn of the spinal cord and terminates in its thoracic nuclei. The thoracic nuclei lie in the medial part of the basis of the posterior horn and contain the cells of the second neuron, whose axons form the posterior spinocerebellar tract. This tract ascends in the posterior part of the lateral funiculus on its own side to the medulla oblongata, where it passes as a component of the inferior cerebellar peduncles to the cortex of vermis. It's evident that in the spinal cord and the medulla oblongata it doesn't cross on the opposite side and therefore it's called the direct cerebellar tract. The cell body of the first neuron is located for the anterior spinal cerebellar tract, again in the spinal ganglion. Its peripheral processes run in the muscular nerve of the proprioceptors of the motor apparatus. Axons enter into the spinal cord and here terminate in the intermediate media nuclei of the spinal cord. From here it passes to the opposite side and ascends as an element of the lateral funiculus of the opposite side, and it passes via the superior cerebellar peduncles into the middle portion of the cerebellum, which is called the vermis. Yes, anterior spinocerebellar tract, it before reaching the cerebellum forms the second decussation at the ratio of the isthmus rhombencephaly. It means it comes back, it turns to the same side. It has two decussations but the ends at the same side. Pyramidal tracts, they are descending or the efferent tracts of our body. They connect the cerebral cortex with the underlying structures. The maintenance of the equilibrium and the correct posture is dependent on the reflex arcs involving various centers, including the spinal cord, cerebellum, and the vestibular nuclei. Afferent impulses for these reflexes are carried by the posterior column tracts, I mean the fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, the spinocerebellar tract, and the others. Efferents reach neurons of the ventral gray column through the rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, and the other extrapyramidal tracts. Interruption of any of these pathways or lesions in the cerebellum, the vestibular nucleus, and other centers concerned can result in various abnormalities involving maintenance of posture and coordination of movements. Inability to maintain the equilibrium of the body while standing or while walking is referred to as ataxia. This may occur as a result of the interruption of afferent proprioceptive pathways, sensor ataxia, disease of the cerebellum itself, or of afferent pathway results in more severe disability. Lack of proprioceptive information can be compensated to a considerable extent by information received through our eyes. The defects are therefore much more pronounced with the eyes closed. Rombe sign. About the pyramidal system, the cell body of the first neuron is located in the inferior end, 1/3 of the cerebral cortex of the precentral gyrus here. The axons of the first neuron descend through the internal capsule, its genu, to the nuclei of the motor cranial nerves or the motor nuclei of the mixed cranial nerves. They are located at the region of the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. The third, fourth pairs of cranial nerves, which are located at the region of the midbrain. 5th, 6th, 7th nerves nuclei are in the region of the pons. 10th, 11th, 12th at the region of the medulla oblongata. This way is called the corticonuclear way or the corticonuclear tract. The axons of the cells of the cranial nerve nuclei, the cell bodies of the second neuron mentioned above, emerge from the brain as a component of the corresponding cranial nerves, run to striated muscles and innervated by these nerves. And again, the cell body of the first neuron is located in the superior 2/3 of the precentral gyrus of the cerebral cortex for the anterior and the lateral corticospinal or pyramidal tract. The axons of these neurons forming the cerebrospinal tract descend through the corona radiata into the internal capsule, the anterior part of its dorsal limb, then into the base of the cerebral peduncles, its middle 2/3 part, and at last into a pars ventralis of pons and into the medulla oblongata. In the inferior part of the medulla oblongata, in the lowest part of the medulla oblongata, 3/4 part of the fibers of this tract cross the opposite side, form the decussation, and descend in the lateral funiculi of the spinal cord to form the lateral corticospinal or pyramidal tract that terminate in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. The other remaining 1/4, 25% of the fibers of the corticospinal tract descends in the anterior funiculi of their own side of the spinal cord to form the anterior corticospinal or pyramidal tract. Anterior corticospinal and the lateral corticospinal tracts. Then this tract passes to the opposite side as a component of the anterior wide commission. It means all pyramidal tracts are decussated. Finally, the whole fibers of the corticospinal tract are crossed. The axons of the motor cells are located in the anterior horn. The cell bodies of the second neurons terminate as components of the spinal nerves in the striated muscles of the trunk and the limbs and supplies it by these nerves. The cortex of each hemisphere innervates the muscles of the upper and the lower limbs on the opposite side, but the respiratory muscles of the trunk are concerned with the both hemispheres. The terminology used in relation to motor dysfunction, paralysis, paresis, monoplegia, means paralysis of one limb only, hemiplegia, paralysis of one half of the body involving both upper and the lower limbs of that half. Right side hemiplegia will involve right upper limb and the lower limb. Left side hemiplegia will involve the left upper limb and the lower limb. Paraplegia, paralysis of either both upper limbs or both lower limbs. And quadriplegia, paralysis of all four limbs. Ordinary, about the extrapyramidal system. The pyramidal system starts in cerebral cortex by the base pyramidal cells that regulates the voluntary movements of certain group of muscles. The extrapyramidal system differs from the pyramidal system in that it arises from the subcortical structures and maintains the tone of the body musculature and regulates unconscious compound autonomic movements. The extrapyramidal system consists of the subcortical structures and extrapyramidal tracts. The components of the subcortical structures, first of course, the corpus striatum, thalamus, subthalamic body, and the substantia nigra, the nucleus ruber, and the nucleus dentatus of the cerebellum, and the conducting tract connected them. Mainly, the autonomic regulation of the body muscles are concerned with the connection of all subcortical nuclei with each other, also with the nucleus ruber and the nucleus vestibularis, the rubrospinal and the vestibulospinal tracts. About the rubrospinal tract, it's the most important extrapyramidal tract. The cell body of the first neuron is located in the nucleus ruber. Ruber means the red nucleus. The axons of these cells cross to the opposite side, forming the tegmental decussation or decussation of Forelli in the midbrain, of course. Then descend through the brainstem into the lateral funiculi of the spinal cord and terminate in the motor neurons of the anterior horn. The axons of the neurons are located in the anterior horn. The cell bodies of the second neurons run as a component of the spinal nerves to the striated muscle innervating. About the vestibulospinal tract, this tract plays a major role in coordination of movements as it connects the nuclei of the vestibular apparatus with the anterior horns of the spinal cord. The cell body of the first neuron is located in the vestibular nuclei, whose axons pass in the anterior funiculi of the spinal cord and terminate in the motor neurons of the anterior horns. The axons of the second neuron pass in the anterior roots and stretch as the components of the muscle nerves to striated muscles of the neck, trunk, limbs, which regulate the muscle tone. The cell body for the cerebellar rubrospinal tract, for this tract of the first neuron, is located in the second layer of the cerebellar cortex. The axons of these neurons are terminated in the dentate nucleus of the cerebellum, which consists of the second neuron. Then the axons of the second neuron end as a component of the superior cerebral peduncles in the nucleus ruber, whereas the third link begins. The axons of the third neuron forming the rubrospinal tract passes to the opposite side in the midbrain and descends through the brainstem and further in the lateral funiculi of the spinal cord to the anterior horn. This is where the fourth neuron originates, whose axons pass in the anterior roots and then stretch as a component of the spinal nerves to striated muscles. These are the literature sources which we use for preparation of this lecture. Thank you for attention.